In the hollowed-out heart of a forgotten kingdom, where mist clings to crumbling ramparts like a shroud, lies a story etched not in stone, but in blood. The wind that whispers through the vacant corridors of the Onyx Palace carries no tales of glory, only the sigh of profound sorrow. It speaks of a throne built on bones, a crown forged in betrayal, and a silence that screams louder than any war cry. This is a chronicle of ghosts, a king whose ambition was a pyre, a princess whose innocence was a sacrificial flame, and a queen whose final rest was a crimson tapestry of murder. Long before the dust settled and the history books were sealed, these halls witnessed a tragedy so complete that it poisoned the very earth upon which the palace stood. The air still feels heavy here, thick with the weight of unspoken secrets and the chilling echo of a final, desperate plea. We do not seek heroes in this tale, for there are none to be found. We seek only the chilling truth of how power devours, how love is corrupted, and how even the purest heart can be crushed beneath the unyielding march of fate. This is the story of the queen who slept in blood, a lesson that reminds us that some stains can never be washed away. He was not born to rule. He was a creature of the borderlands, a man carved from the unforgiving stone of the northern mountains. His name, before it was spoken with fear in the capital, was a battle cry among mercenaries and warlords. He rose not through lineage but through sheer, unrelenting force. With an army of desperate men loyal only to the promise of gold and glory, he shattered the kingdom's defenses, his banner a black wolf against a field of gray. The old king, a frail and scholarly man, was no match for the storm that descended upon him. The royal family vanished overnight, swallowed by the shadows of a brutal coup. Whispers claimed they were put to the sword in their sleep, their quiet deaths the foundation upon which a new dynasty was built. The warlord crowned himself king, his iron gauntlet resting heavily on a throne that did not belong to him. He was a man of cold pragmatism and boundless ambition, his eyes holding the chilling emptiness of a winter sky. He had conquered the land, but the loyalty of its people remained a distant shore, and he knew that a throne taken by force must be held by fear, cunning, and an alliance sealed in the most sacred of vows. To legitimize his bloody ascension, the new king sought a bride from a noble, ancient house, a symbol of peace to mask the violence of his reign. From a neighboring land of sun-drenched valleys came a woman whose beauty was said to calm the most savage of hearts. She was a political pawn, a treasure offered to a beast in exchange for a fragile truce. Her arrival at the Onyx Palace was a spectacle of conflicted emotions. The common folk saw in her a glimmer of hope, a touch of grace in a court of brutish soldiers. The king's own council, however, saw a foreign serpent, her wisdom a quiet threat to their influence. She moved through the cold, dark halls of the palace like a phantom of light, her gentle nature a stark contrast to her husband's iron will. She was learned, fluent in diplomacy and the arts, talents the king found both useful and unnerving. He treated her as his most prized possession, a beautiful ornament for his court, but never his equal. She was the kingdom's queen, adorned in silks and jewels, but behind her serene smile lay the heart of a gilded prisoner, trapped in a loveless pact and surrounded by wolves who wore the faces of men. Her duty was to provide an heir, to secure the king's fragile legacy with the one thing his swords could not conquer, a legitimate bloodline. When the bells of the grand cathedral rang out, they announced not a victory in battle but the birth of the princess. She was a perfect creation, a fusion of her mother's ethereal grace and her father's piercing gaze. For a fleeting moment, a genuine light seemed to touch the king's hardened heart. He held his daughter aloft, not as a conqueror holding a spoil of war, but as a father beholding a miracle. In the princess, the kingdom saw its future, a union of the old world's nobility and the new world's strength. Her laughter was a melody that briefly silenced the palace's ever-present whispers, her innocence a stark white canvas in a world of gray and black. The queen cherished her daughter with a fierce, protective love, seeing in her the one pure thing in her gilded cage. She would spend hours with the child in the royal gardens, telling her stories of sunnier lands and gentler times, a desperate attempt to shield her from the encroaching shadows of the court. But hope is a fragile thing in a kingdom built on secrets. The princess was more than a daughter. She was a symbol, a dynastic tool, and her very existence would soon become the centerpiece in a game far more deadly than she could ever comprehend. The initial joy surrounding the princess's birth soon curdled into something darker. The palace was a nest of vipers, where loyalty was a currency traded for power and betrayal was a constant, unspoken threat. The king's most trusted general, a man whose hands were as bloody as his own, watched the queen's growing influence with jealous eyes. He saw her wisdom not as an asset, but as a challenge to the king's absolute authority. He and other members of the council began to sow seeds of doubt, their whispers like poison in the king's ear. They spoke of the queen's foreign blood, her quiet conversations with visiting diplomats, her preference for books over the sword. Every gesture was twisted, every word reframed as a potential conspiracy. The queen, isolated and with few true allies, felt the walls closing in. The smiles of the courtiers were masks hiding daggers. The shadows in the corridors seemed to stretch and writhe, filled with unseen watchers. She began to notice the king's gaze upon her changing, the warmth of a husband replaced by the cold suspicion of a monarch. The very air grew thick with paranoia, and the queen knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the peace was a lie, a temporary calm before a storm of unimaginable violence. Having secured his throne and an heir, the king's ambition did not quell. It festered, growing into a ravenous hunger for absolute dominion. The kingdom was not enough. He dreamt of empire, of a legacy that would dwarf the dynasties he had overthrown. He spent his nights hunched over maps, his fingers tracing new borders, his mind orchestrating campaigns of conquest that would cost thousands of lives. To fund his wars, he levied crushing taxes upon the people, bleeding the countryside dry to feed his ever-expanding army. His rule became increasingly tyrannical. Dissent was no longer tolerated. It was extinguished with brutal efficiency. The gallows in the city square were never empty. The king saw his family not as a source of comfort, but as instruments of his will. The queen was a means to forge alliances, her grace a tool for diplomacy. The princess, still a child, was already being considered as a bride for a ruthless foreign prince, a pawn to be sacrificed for a strategic advantage on the global stage. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming a force of nature, a vortex of ambition that threatened to consume everything and everyone around him, including the very family he had created to legitimize his reign. Behind the facade of regal serenity, the queen was slowly drowning. Her days were a performance of perfect composure, but her nights were a private hell. She was plagued by a terrible knowledge, a secret she had unearthed from a terrified old servant who had witnessed the night the king took the throne. She knew the truth of what had happened to the previous royal family, that they had not simply vanished. They had been butchered in their beds, the young princes and princesses murdered on the king's direct order. This horrifying secret was a poison in her soul. She was married to a monster, and she was raising her own innocent daughter in a palace whose foundations were soaked in the blood of other innocent children. This guilt gnawed at her, hollowing her out from the inside. She would often stand on her balcony, staring out at the moonlit kingdom, and weep in silence, her tears the only rebellion she could afford. Her pleas for the king to show mercy to his people were met with cold dismissal. She was trapped, her every move watched, her heart torn between her duty to a tyrant and her own crumbling conscience. She was the queen, but she was the most powerless person in the entire kingdom. The princess grew up within the suffocating confines of the Onyx Palace, her world a strange mixture of opulence and fear. She played with dolls dressed as ladies-in-waiting while outside her window, men were dragged to the gallows. Her mother taught her poetry and song, while her father taught her that a princess's only value was in the alliance her marriage could secure. She was a delicate flower growing in the shadow of a volcano, unaware of the molten fury brewing beneath her feet. As she blossomed into a young woman, her beauty became a topic of discussion in courts across the continent. Suitors sent emissaries, but they were not courting a girl. They were bidding on a strategic asset. The king saw her as his ultimate bargaining chip, a key to unlock the northern territories through a marriage to a prince known for his cruelty and ambition. The queen was horrified, arguing desperately against sending her only child into the arms of such a man. But her words were meaningless. The princess's fate was being decided in war rooms and council chambers, her future bartered away for land and power. She was a pawn in her father's brutal game, and her innocence was the first sacrifice he was willing to make on the altar of his imperial ambitions. The truth, once buried, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. A nobleman, whose family had been loyal to the old regime and was thought to be long dead, had survived the king's purge. For years, he had lived in exile, gathering evidence, nursing a burning desire for vengeance. He returned to the kingdom in disguise, a phantom of the past, and began to spread the story that had only been whispered in the darkest corners of the palace. He produced a witness, the terrified old servant who had confided in the queen, and a signed order from the king, stolen from the royal archives, detailing the command to execute the entire previous royal line, children included. The secret was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. The revelation spread through the city like wildfire, turning simmering resentment into open outrage. The king, the great conqueror, was revealed to be nothing more than a child killer, a usurper whose throne was built on a lie. The queen was implicated in the scandal, her silence seen not as the act of a terrified woman, but as complicity. The kingdom's foundation of fear and forced loyalty shattered in an instant, and the stage was set for a bloody reckoning. The revelation of the king's founding atrocity was the spark that ignited the pyre of rebellion. The people, crushed under the weight of his taxes and tyranny, now had a righteous cause. Led by the vengeful noblemen, mobs formed in the city streets, their tools of labor becoming weapons of war. Banners bearing the sigil of the old dynasty were unfurled. The rebellion was swift and brutal. Loyalties within the king's own army fractured, with many soldiers laying down their arms or joining the uprising, unwilling to die for a monarch who had lied to them all. The Onyx Palace, once an impregnable fortress, became a tomb under siege. The sounds of battle echoed through the marble halls, the clang of steel, the splintering of wood, and the screams of the dying. The king, trapped and cornered, descended into a maelstrom of paranoia and rage. He saw traitors everywhere in the eyes of his guards, his advisors, and most of all in the terrified face of his wife. He believed she had leaked the secret, that she had been plotting against him all along. The kingdom he had forged in blood was now drowning in it, and his iron grip was finally, irrevocably broken. As the rebels breached the palace gates, the king, his mind shattered by betrayal and defeat, stormed into the queen's bedchambers. He found her there, clutching a small wooden effigy of the princess, her face a mask of pure terror. He did not see the woman who had given him an heir, the queen who had brought a touch of grace to his brutal court. He saw only the source of his downfall. He accused her of treason, his voice a venomous roar that echoed in the opulent room. He saw her silence not as fear, but as a confession of guilt. Her pleas for mercy were lost in his madness. The attack was sudden and savage. He used not a sword, but a ceremonial dagger from the wall, a symbol of their poisoned union. The queen collapsed onto her bed, the silken sheets of white and gold turning a deep, horrifying crimson. Her life ebbed away in the very room where she had sought refuge from the horrors of his reign, her final breath a silent gasp. She was the queen who had slept beside a murderer for years, and in her final moments, she became the queen who slept in blood, a tragic testament to her husband's ultimate act of cruelty. The rebels found the king standing over the queen's body, his hands and clothes stained with her blood, his eyes vacant and broken. The sight of their murdered queen, a woman many had seen as a symbol of hope, galvanized the rebel soldiers. All respect for his royal status vanished. They dragged him from the room, through the halls of his conquered palace, and out into the public square. He was not given a trial or a swift execution. The vengeful nobleman who had orchestrated his downfall wanted a more poetic justice. The king, The man who had craved an empire was chained to the base of his own grand statue. For 3 days he was left there, stripped of his titles and dignity, enduring the scorn and fury of the people he had terrorized. They threw stones and refused, their hatred a physical force. On the 3rd day, as the sun set, he was publicly beheaded, his death not a martyr's end, but the pathetic slaughter of a disgraced tyrant. His head was placed on a pike atop the city walls, a gruesome warning that even the most powerful crowns offer no protection from the consequences of monstrous deeds. In the chaos, the princess was captured. The new rulers, led by the noblemen from the old dynasty, saw her not as an innocent victim, but as the last living remnant of a tainted bloodline. To kill her would be to repeat the sins of the fallen king, but to let her live freely was a risk they would not take. Her existence was a threat, a potential rallying point for any remaining loyalists. So, they chose a fate for her that was crueler than death. She was not imprisoned in a dungeon, but in the highest room of the palace's northern tower, the very room where she was born. Her name was struck from all official records. It became forbidden to speak of her. She was to be forgotten, erased from history, a living ghost haunting the halls of her own home. She was given food and water, but no visitors, no books, no contact with the outside world. She would watch the seasons change from a single, barred window, her only companions the silence and the ghosts of her murdered parents. Her innocence had saved her from the executioner's axe, only to condemn her to a lifetime of silent, solitary madness, a lost soul forgotten by the world she was born to one day rule. The kingdom moved on as kingdoms always do. The new dynasty, a restoration of the old line, worked tirelessly to erase the memory of the usurper king. His statues were torn down, his name vilified in the official histories, and his reign portrayed as a dark, bloody chapter best forgotten. The Onyx Palace was cleansed, its tapestries replaced, its bloodstains scrubbed from the floors. But a scar remained. The people were free from the king's tyranny, but they were now ruled by a man whose heart had been hardened by years of seeking vengeance. The whispers did not cease. They simply changed their tune. The story of the murdered queen and the forgotten princess became a forbidden folktale, a ghost story told by parents to frighten their children into obedience. The kingdom was peaceful, but it was a brittle, haunted peace. The throne, once a symbol of power and glory, was now seen for what it truly was: a cursed chair, a prize that demanded a price too terrible to pay. The land had healed, but the memory of the blood that had been spilled lingered like a poison in the soil, ensuring that no one would ever truly feel safe within those palace walls again. What is a kingdom but a collection of stories? This one began with a man's insatiable ambition and ended in a tomb of silence. The king, who sought to build an eternal empire, was reduced to a severed head on a pike, his legacy nothing but ash. The queen, who brought light and grace, was consumed by the darkness she was forced to embrace, her tragic end a symbol of innocence betrayed. And the princess, the emblem of a hopeful future, became a footnote that was never written, a whisper in a locked tower, her life a long, drawn-out death. Their tale is a chilling reminder that power built on cruelty is a fortress built on sand. It shows us that a crown does not protect the head that wears it. It only makes it a more visible target. The throne of the Onyx Palace stands empty now, a cold monument to the ruinous cycle of greed and vengeance. It teaches a sorrowful, eternal lesson. Ambition, when untethered from humanity, will always carve a path to its own destruction, leaving nothing but ghosts and tragic tales in its wake. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.